In the third section, I want to talk about how this notion of race has been picked up and developed in a philosophical context. In particular, I want to talk about the work of Sally Haslanger. First of all, I want to talk about the two kind of biological theories of race to show you a little bit why a biological notion of race doesn't seem to work. So on a biological account of race, there's this idea that people inherit their race and that one's race is part of one's nature and is passed along to one's biological offspring. So there's this idea that there's this kind of genetic basis that allows one to pass one's race on to other people. And that this suggests that racial natures underlie and explain bodily and behavioral differences between groups. What conceptual work on the concept of race has shown us is that this idea doesn't work. There are, in fact, no racial natures that underlie and explain bodily and behavioral differences between groups. There is no set of properties that a member of a race necessarily has by virtue of which they are a member of that race, and that explains their characteristic behavior and abilities. So people have been looking, people have tried for quite a long time now to say, okay, so what are the physiological features that you see in every single Black person? Do they all have the same kind of nose? No. Do they all have the same kind of hair? No. Do they all have the same skin color? No. And the same is true of white people too. So people have been looking for a phenotypic or a kind of physical expression of a particular body type that is the same across races, Black and white races, for example, and no one has been able to find one. And so when people gave up on the idea that there was some kind of common phenotype to different races, they started looking, of course, for underlying genotype. And that was a failure too. No one has been able to find a common genotype that is the same among all peoples who are deemed Black or white. The pursuit of a biological concept of race has been a failure. Now, other people say, well, okay, so maybe that more robust biological concept of race has been a failure, but maybe we can have a minimalist biological theory of race, right? And say, well, race is distinguished from other groups, like a race is distinguished from other groups of human beings by patterns of visible physical features, common ancestry, and a common geographical origin. And this doesn't work either, right? The visibly notable and biologically relevant clumping that's required by a minimalist theory does not occur. You cannot find these visible patterns of physical features. You cannot find a common ancestry of all peoples who are lumped together as Black or white. And you cannot find a common geographical region for all peoples who are lumped together as Black or white. So the pursuit of even a minimalist biological concept of race has been a failure, and philosophers and race theorists have concluded that since these groups' putative distinctiveness is not legitimated by biology, there are no races. So from the point of view of natural science, race is not a fact of nature. So you remember the first premise in the traditional view was that race is a fact of nature, and subsequent conceptual and scientific inquiry endeavoring to find the underlying biological fact that gives rise to something like a notion of race has been a failure. No one has been able to do it. There are no visibly notable and biologically relevant features that allow us to actually clump people into races. What is now probably the dominant view among people who actually work on these issues and do important conceptual work on them is what's called the social political concept of race. And this view has been developed notably by Sally Haslanger in her 2012 book. I recommend looking at it. It's a fascinating account. And so Haslanger argues that a group of people, G, is racialized. So there aren't any races. There are just racialized populations, right? So racialization is an activity that people engage in. Races aren't a fact of nature. We racialize people. Okay, that's the basic idea. So a group G is racialized relative to some context C, if and only if the members of G are all and only those who are observed or imagined to have certain bodily features presumed in C to be evidence of ancestral links to a certain geographical region. So I said, right, you can't actually find that these people have common bodily features. So that's why she says they're observed or imagined to have those common bodily features. Secondly, these are people whose having or being imagined to have these features marks them in the context as appropriately occupying kinds of social position that are either subordinate or privileged. So here's Baldwin's view, right? So Baldwin is saying race is a social political concept that's used to subordinate certain groups and to raise the status of other groups. And that's what Haslanger is saying. So we observe or imagine to observe certain features among a group of people. And then on the basis of our imagining them having those features, we put them in a particular social position in a hierarchy. So either they're subordinated and subjugated, or they're privileged and they're at the top of the hierarchy. And finally, we're talking about those people whose satisfying 1 and 2 plays or would play a role in their systematic subordination or privilege in that context. So this is just a spelling out really of the view that Baldwin articulates, right? Race is not the source of racism, rather racism is the source of race, right? Because people had racist motives, they wanted to unite with a certain group of people and subjugate another group. They racialized everyone. They racialized themselves and said, oh yeah, so people who have or are imagined to have the characteristics that we have, we're at the top of the hierarchy. And people who are imagined or observed to have these other properties, they belong at the bottom of the hierarchy. And so what's going on is there's this intentional act where people are being subjugated on the basis of a concept that has been invented, not one that has been found in nature. So I think that this leaves us with an interesting problem Baldwin and Haslanger are keenly aware of, namely, and Baldwin says this straight out, right? He says, what this implies is that there are in fact no white people, and there are no black people either, because there are no races. Races have been invented for racist purposes, right? So there are no actual races, there are just racialized groups. So the question then comes, well, how are we supposed to live with that? How are we supposed to make sense of that, right? If we've grown up in this racialized world and we understand ourselves as white or black or whatever, belonging to some kind of race, what are we supposed to do? Are we just supposed to quit talking about race? So this is a response that I often get from students when I talk about this in a philosophical context, when we see that race is something that was the child of racism and not the other way around. People say, well, let's just quit talking about it. But the problem with that is that there's a major risk, namely that it benefits people who are at the top of the hierarchy. If race is really a hierarchical concept, then it's doing all this political work, which is making certain people's lives worse and other people's lives relatively better. And if we just stop talking about it, then it seems like we lose important tools in fighting for justice and trying to generate a more equal society.